In this iteration of Ophelia, there are many things going on here. You can talk about the whiteness of her dress, which becomes darker as it moves into the water. You can talk about her state of distress and distress here. She holds her hand on her heart, but she's also censoring herself as the water is stripping her and taking away her clothing. You have a sense here of sort of a peaceful river that's moving into the background there as it goes around that bend, but she's holding on to this branch, perhaps the last semblance here of her sanity. You can see flowers near her hand and also on her head, which is a symbol of this kind of like childlike innocence that we had discussed earlier. This version of Ophelia is different. We have a very different background. You see this mucky water. It looks to be a swamp, something really disgusting. She's not in the water, so there's a sense here, greater sense of her agency in this as she looks into the water, preparing to jump. She herself looks very childlike, certainly compared to the more voluptuous Ophelia in the last image. Here she's almost represented as a nymph, almost an elf, some kind of fairy, a pixie, a very kind of like pure and almost supernatural creature. Again, you see dressed in white, you see that garland around her head as she contemplates her own demise. This is probably the most famous image of Ophelia. You see her represented in what very much looks like a coffin. Her face is devoid of life. Her arms are raised in almost a posture of rigor mortis. You see the embroidery on her dress trailing into the water, as well as herself kind of wreathed in these flowers, remnants of a garland in her hair, which you can see as well. Again, something that for the romantic imagination was just pretty. This is an object of art. There's not a lot of like sympathy or empathy stitched into this. She's in a very beautiful place in this very sad scenario, but also something that is worthy of artistic contemplation. So moving into the late 1800s in the Victorian time, so we've looked at the Augustan time, the Romantic time, and now in the Victorian time, the late 1800s, Ophelia was actually used in then modern psychiatry to describe this kind of malady that was determined to be female hysteria. Elaine Showalter says medical textbooks illustrated their discussions of female patients with sketches of Ophelia like maidens. So you can see these images of real women who had who were suffering from mental illness and who were costumed by their male psychiatrists to put forward this fiction of Ophelia like madness. So you see the woman on the left with her garland, and then the two women on the right whose hands are lifted in almost the exact same posture that we saw in our last image of Ophelia. Showalter says the Victorian madwoman looks mutely out from men's pictures and acts a part men had staged and directed. This is exactly what happened to Ophelia, and now it's happening to real women. It's not just a fictional character who's been marginalized, but these actual women have been thrown into these costumes and these modes of behavior in order to conform to men's view of what quote-unquote female hysteria should look like. The turn of the century, though, brought some greater freedom for women, and so also some female voices who described Ophelia as an inspiring, even sanctified emblem of righteousness. These women were beginning to rescue Ophelia from a male-directed commentary and instead chose to see in her some true feminine heroism. This was not the only view, though. Freud came in and said a bunch of weird stuff, as Freud has almost always done. And other people, other psychiatrists looked at her and said, okay, well, it's not female love melancholy, but it's schizophrenia. And this was used again as a way to marginalize and dismiss Ophelia. And the paintings we'll look at in a second, though, these are paintings by female artists, and you'll see a difference between what we saw before and what we see now. So in this image of Ophelia, again, an image painted by a female artist, you see her in white, not the same kind of virginal pure white, but something that seems much more regal. You see everything else is in shadow, except for her, and her shadow itself is a train of light. She is covered in flowers, but rather than suggest a kind of pathetic or childish nature, This almost seems like an Amazon queen. She seems possessed of a great nobility and bravery. There's something wild about her, not connected to insanity, but connected to spirit, some sense of a true and noble nature that's in this depiction of Ophelia. Similarly, in this image, we don't get a sense of some madness or some craziness. In fact, you might almost view this image as somewhat masculine, perhaps even in the way that this woman is costumed, something that would be representative of some images of Jesus, to suggest here not the crazed, mad heroine, but rather the noble, suffering Savior, and to give some dignity to Ophelia's tragedy, that it isn't just the result of some kind of madness, but might be the result of tremendous suffering on an almost godlike scale.